Luo Binghe took on the blow without making a sound. To tell the truth, Shen Qingqiu hadn't expected to truly hit Luo Binghe, but that didn't stop this punch from feeling extremely satisfying. It was like all the pent-up anger that had been building in him for the past few days had been smashed out along with it. Suddenly, the system chirped with congratulatory notice. Congratulations! Satisfaction points plus 500. Shen Qingqiu was utterly speechless. Luo Binghe was really a tried and true masochist, the kind who was happy being roughed up, hit him once and earned 500 satisfaction points. Even the system notification had become a lively and flirtatious emoji, and on top of that, it came with a never-before-seen pair of tildes. Shen Qingqiu had never met a greater weirdo in all the years of his life, and this weirdo was one he'd raised himself. Shen Qingqiu was bemoaning the failure of his pedagogical results, but Luo Binghe wasn't playing anymore. He flicked his right hand, and Shen Qingqiu accidentally released the spiritual energy he'd been holding. With a bang, it smashed a beautifully shaped hole in the ceiling. Dust drifted downward, blocked by Luo Binghe above him. Luo Binghe's hands tugged at Shen Qingqiu's outer robes, easily tearing them apart. Hit me all you want. You can't kill me either way. This disciple gladly accepts Shi Zun's instruction, he said, a smile on his face. But a mournful tone seemed to hide behind that smile. Distracted from even how his clothes were being torn off, Shen Qingqiu's heart clenched, and he involuntarily stopped moving. But Luo Binghe didn't give Shen Qingqiu any more time to pity him. Suddenly, a hand ripped open his inner robes and crept to his waist, skin to skin. Shen Qingqiu went limp for a moment, then slammed his sword hilt into Luo Binghe's forehead with a thud. You beast! Luo Binghe seemed to have given up on himself. If Shi Zun sees me as no better than a beast either way, I might as well live up to expectations. Shen Qingqiu wanted to laugh in anger, but suddenly his vision blurred, his body swayed, and Xiuya crashed to the ground. There was something wrenching at him, like his whole soul was about to be pulled out of his body. He could only go stiff. Luo Binghe also stopped his movements, shocked. A mere moment later, Shen Qingqiu's head began to hurt like it was going to explode. Countless shattered scenes flashed before his eyes at top speed, sometimes blank white, sometimes a pitch-black mass, and sometimes he even saw vague human figures. His eardrums stung from the sharp ringing in his ears. Luo Binghe couldn't spare a moment for caution. He hurriedly vaulted into a sitting position and reached out to hold Shen Qingqiu down, but he couldn't manage to keep him still. It was like a giant pair of hands were roughly dragging Shen Qingqiu's brains and soul out of his body, and he held his head, rolling back and forth on the ground as he struggled. Something was screaming, stretching hands towards him from every direction, screeching and tearing at his soul. Shi Zun, I was just trying to scare you. Don't take it so seriously. What's wrong? Luo Binghe cried out in a panic. Shen Qingqiu's body thrashed back and forth in his embrace. Luo Binghe held him with one arm, hurriedly scanning his body with spiritual energy. And though there was no abnormalities, Shen Qingqiu's screams were horribly shrill, as if a red-hot piece of iron had been poked right into his brain. Luo Binghe tried everything he could think of, to no avail. As Shen Qingqiu's pulse grew weaker and weaker, Luo Binghe began to tremble faintly, then more and more violently. In the end, he couldn't keep himself upright anymore, and he collapsed from his half-kneeling position until both knees hit the ground. Guards! Luo Binghe yelled. Every one of you, get in here! Shen Qingqiu's eyes shot open. It was pitch dark. His heart raced, eardrums seeming to hammer alongside his pulse. In order to determine whether it was just so dark that he couldn't see his own hand in front of his face, or if he had in fact gone blind, Shen Qingqiu really did stretch out his hand to test his vision. Before he got very far, his fingertips hit a sturdy wall. Shen Qingqiu began to slowly feel around. After a while, he had a basic sense of his surroundings. He was currently inside a cramped space. It seemed he had been placed in a rectangular stone box. He lightly patted the stone walls to find that they were ice cold, the material slick and smooth like marble. When he surveyed them with spiritual energy, he found that they weren't too thick, probably no more than 4 inches. He felt around some more, sucked in a breath and held it, then abruptly struck out. With a rumble of spiritual energy, he landed a heavy blow in the center of the stone cover above him. After 3 strikes in a row, the darkness split apart into pieces along with the sound of shattering rock. Fresh air poured in. Shen Qingqiu abruptly sat up and drew a few deep breaths before he discovered the air wasn't fresh at all. Instead, it was like underground air that had sat stagnant for years. It was extremely thin. When he looked down, he found that he was lying in a coffin. This rectangular stone box was, it seemed, a finely sculpted stone casket, pure white like jade. Shen Qingqiu placed a hand lightly on the edge of the coffin and leapt out. Looking around, he found he stood in a dimly lit stone room. The coffin, whose lid he had blasted, was placed on an altar in the center of the room, and disordered piles of dusty objects were strung around the corners. Weapons, gemstones, books, bottles, and jars lay scattered about. The glint of blades and the glow of jewels shone beneath the thick layer of dust, sending faint light flowing about the room. The walls around Shen Qingqiu were painted with murals of demons in crazed revelry, surrounding him from all sides. The holy mausoleum of the demon race! This was Shen Qingqiu's conclusion. Before he could digest this information, he inadvertently looked down and was struck dumb by another piece of information. His body wasn't the one grown from the sun moon dew mushroom flower seed. This was Shen Qingqiu's original body. The holy mausoleum purportedly housed the means by which to revive the dead, and it looked like this really wasn't hearsay. Given the situation, it was likely that someone had snuck Shen Qingqiu's corpse into the holy mausoleum, then activated a soul-summoning array, yanking him away from his new body. The holy mausoleum was a restricted area from the demon race. Generations of supreme rulers had been entombed there after their deaths. Anyone who entered without having reached that lofty position would die. But Shen Qingqiu had been brought inside as a corpse, and only after his soul returned to his body had he started breathing again. By essentially taking advantage of a loophole, he'd gained the chance to play tourist. Shen Qingqiu tried and found that the flow of his spiritual energy was perfectly fine. Duo Binghe said he had spent 5 years restoring the meridians of this body. This turned out to be true. As for the without a cure poison, Shen Qingqiu didn't feel any unresponsiveness at present, but he didn't know if its effects had been dispelled. Once a soul had been placed into a body created from a dew mushroom flower seed, the second that soul was taken away, the body would quickly wither and die. Shen Qingqiu couldn't guess what sort of expression Luo Binghe would have on his face, standing in front that withered and dried up body of his. But before his thoughts could drift, the system chirped with a message notification. Gentle reminder, you have entered the advanced level plot scenario, The Holy Mausoleum, a quote, plot hole filling, unquote, quest has been issued. Please rise to the occasion and take the initiative. Shen Qingqiu gave it an "oh" and continued to crouch in place. Please rise to the occasion and take the initiative. Shen Qingqiu didn't move. Alert, please rise to... I know, off with you. What a pain in the ass. Shen Qingqiu exited the room, thinking back on the Holy Mausoleum subplot in the original novel as he walked. Residences in the demon realm were hidden beneath the earth while their mausoleums were built above ground. In short, all their customs were the complete opposite of the human realms. Not only was a mausoleum filled with layer upon layer of wicked mechanisms, there were also countless demonic beasts guarding the tombs, hidden in the shadows. If it weren't for the system's diabolical chattering, he'd had been on drugs to try wandering around these tomb corridors. The corridors were extremely dark, but Shen Qingqiu didn't use a fire spell. He held his breath and silently walked onward. Not long after, he began to hear the slow and heavy sound of breathing. Or he called it breathing, but it was actually more like the gasps of the dying. Shen Qingqiu stood still. They had shown up entirely too fast. From the darkness, a lone rail-thin figure gradually emerged. Next, a second and third followed right behind, slowly drifting closer like wandering souls. These figures swayed thrice with each step, getting closer and closer. Shen Qingqiu didn't make a sound. Turning sideways, he slowed his breaths as much as possible. Of all the demonic beasts guarding the tomb, these were one of the lowest level with the highest encounter rates. Blind corpses. Blind corpses were called blind, but in truth, they wanted for not a single eye. Instead, they had a few extra pairs more than other monsters, all squished onto their faces. It made for an incredibly bizarre sight, and they would definitely make anyone with trypophobia ache with disgust. However, although they had a lot of eyes, the organs were basically useless. Most of the time, blind corpses were sightless even with their eyes open, their efficiency dismal as they wandered and patrolled the Holy Mausoleum. Though their eyes were both numerous and large, the organs were severely degenerated. However, these eyes were incredibly sensitive to light, and they could catch even the faintest reflected glow at top speed. As soon as blind corpses caught sight of something, their manner would abruptly change, and they would instinctively launch a fierce attack at the source of illumination. At that time, they would no longer move at the speed they were now, as they slowly wandered the corridors in lines. In short, monsters like this weren't frightening by themselves. What was frightening was a certain object that often appeared alongside them. As Shen Qingqiu thought this, a blind corpse tottered close, and he sidestepped to avoid it. Suddenly, a faint flame began to burn amidst the darkness. This wisp of flame was a dim green. It glowed brighter and brighter until it illuminated the entire corridor with a vivid emerald hue. Those blind corpses about to brush past Shen Qingqiu suddenly turned around. On every face were embedded 4 or 5 pairs of giant bloodshot eyeballs, glaring straight at him where he stood just within reach. Last breath candles! Shen Qingqiu moved with extraordinary speed, and in the next second he had flashed to the end of the corridor. But no matter where he fled, a faint green light appeared alongside him, illuminating his figure with nowhere to hide. He was fast, but the blind corpses triggered by the light source were faster. A few blind corpses threw themselves at Shen Qingqiu, and he sent them flying. Last breath candles use the qi and breath of the living as fuel. As long as a living person or creature approached, they ignited on their own. At first, they sounded like random trinkets that could be used to play tricks while traveling the martial arts world, but when deployed together with blind corpses, the effect was devastatingly brutal. Think about it. If an intruder managed to get into the holy mausoleum, no matter where they went, they still had to breathe. Once they did, the candles ignited, and you couldn't put them all out. Any corner of the holy mausoleum could house arrays of last breath candles. The thrones of blind corpses would then pounce, and only after the intruder's death would the candlelight gradually dim. Last breath, what an aptly chosen name! Take now, for example, more and more blind corpses had arrived in response to the light, to the point that the tomb corridor was overflowing. Shen Qingqiu rushed out of the corridor and into a room. This hall was much wider and more imposing, and in the center was a coffin placed high up on an altar. Shen Qingqiu leapt up and tried to throw it open, but it didn't budge. When he tried to hit it again, there was a deep thud, but it still didn't move an inch. To think it was so much more solid than the stone casket he had found himself lying in earlier. Shen Qingqiu wondered if there was someone inside. He knocked on the lid. "Might I take shelter in your honored residence?" He was just saying whatever, but after he knocked a few times, a voice actually spoke from within the sarcophagus. The voice was clearly coming from the coffin, but it was as clear as if the speaker was speaking into Shen Qingqiu's ear, not muffled at all. "Do as you please," the voice said, as if smiling. A corpse come to life? Shen Qingqiu was terrified. He swept out his leg, knocking a few blind corpses off the stone casket, then, in another few steps, jumped off the coffin himself and sent a spiritual blast at the ceiling. Loose rubble rolled down. Realizing that the stone of the ceiling was loosening, Shen Qingqiu continued to send out wild blows. He thought to collapse the ceiling and escape in the confusion, thereby burying both the blind corpses and this revived corpse beneath the rubble. But in the chaos of battle, he suddenly heard a low hiss coming from outside the tomb chamber.